The rain had been falling since dawn, turning the winding road into a ribbon of mud streaked with the reflection of a gray, unrelenting sky. The Silver Briar Inn, a modest yet sturdy building of stone and timber, seemed almost to huddle against the storm. Its windows glimmered faintly with candlelight, casting warm pools of amber against the wet earth outside. Inside, Alara Wynne stood behind the oak counter, her hands resting on the worn wood, her fingers tracing the deep grooves left by generations of innkeepers. Her father's hands had pressed here, as had her grandmother's, and perhaps even her great-grandmother's before them. The wood seemed alive with the echoes of laughter, arguments, whispered secrets, and grief, all trapped between the knots and grains. Alara had spent her life knowing the inn. She knew the creak of the third stair when pressed too heavily, the sigh of the back door when opened against the wind, the quiet sound of the hearth settling after the fire had gone out. She knew how the walls held the faint scent of baked bread and smoke from countless winters, and how the air itself seemed to thicken whenever trouble approached. Tonight, the silence that fell over the room carried a tension that was almost physical, like the pause before a bell tolls. The door opened with a reluctant groan, and the air shifted. Alara's heart gave an involuntary lurch. He stepped inside, a man who seemed not to belong to roads like this, to this rough and rural world. Rain soaked the shoulders of his traveling cloak, and his hood had fallen back to reveal hair that gleamed like burnished iron. His eyes, gray and sharp, swept the room with calm authority, assessing, measuring, taking in everything, without appearing to do so. Two riders followed, silent and alert, their postures disciplined, their hands resting lightly on their swords. Soldiers. Nobles rarely traveled without them. Rooms? Alara asked, her voice steady from habit rather than courage. He regarded her for a long moment, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. 3, he said. His voice was even, calm, and carried a quiet authority that did not need to command. And a meal, if you have one hot. We do, she said. Stew and fresh bread. That will do. As she reached for the keys behind the counter, a strange hesitation twisted in her chest. She had served nobles before, minor lords and traveling merchants, but this man was different. There was a gravity to him, a sense that the choices one made in his presence carried more weight than they had any right to. When she returned, he had removed his gloves. His hands were large, strong, and slightly scarred along the knuckles, the hands of a man accustomed to action, not just command. She handed him the keys, and for a brief moment their fingers brushed. It was so slight, so ordinary, yet it sent a spark through her chest that she could not ignore. He noticed her hesitation. His brow creased slightly. Is something wrong, Innkeeper? She opened her mouth, then closed it again. What could she say? That her instincts had screamed a warning the moment he walked in? That the air itself seemed altered, like the moment before a storm breaks the sky open? No, my lord, she said finally, lowering her gaze. Forgive me. He did not take the keys immediately. Instead, he reached out slowly, deliberately, and took her hand. The contact was gentle, grounding, as if a tether had been thrown across the room. Warmth spread from his palm to hers. It was firm, steady, reassuring, not the touch of a man demanding obedience, but the quiet assurance of someone who knew hesitation and did not condemn it. Alara looked up, startled, meeting his gaze. Do not apologize for listening to yourself, he said softly. Hesitation is not weakness. For a long moment, the inn seemed to fade. There was only the drum of rain against the roof and the warmth of his hand in hers. She felt herself leaning toward him slightly, drawn by an unspoken promise, a subtle invitation to trust. Then he released her. He took the keys and turned toward the stairs with the measured grace of a man accustomed to being obeyed, yet without a trace of arrogance. Ilara remained frozen behind the counter. Her heart raced, and the air felt suddenly too thick, too alive. She did not know his name yet, but she felt an undeniable shift. Something irreversible had occurred in the span of a few breaths. The door closed behind him, and yet she could still feel the warmth of his hand, the steady pull of his presence. All night, the inn seemed to hum with expectation. Every creak of the stairs, every flutter of the curtains in the storm-driven wind felt amplified. Ilara could not sleep. Her mind returned again and again to the moment when their hands had touched, to the way he had spoken her name without ceremony, but with recognition, and to the strange grounding force of his words. Hesitation was not weakness. How strange that such a simple truth could feel like the opening of a door into a new life. By morning, the storm had lessened, leaving the world washed in pale sunlight that reflected off puddles and slick mud. Ilara stood behind the counter again, watching the road with a sense of quiet anticipation. A sensation that both thrilled and unnerved her. She knew, in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing in her life would ever be entirely the same. Her gaze drifted to the stairs where he had gone to his room. A thought lodged itself in her mind, insistent and unwelcome in its clarity. Life had begun to stretch in a direction she had never imagined. A life that might be larger than the inn, larger than the quiet routines she had clung to. She did not yet know what it would demand of her, only that the moment had come when she could not step back. Outside, the rain had left the road glistening. Inside, the inn waited, familiar and steady. But Ilara knew that tonight, something new had begun, a journey of choice and risk, of hesitation and courage, of a hand taken and a life forever altered. She took a deep breath and returned to her work, the warmth of that brief touch lingering, a quiet fire in her chest that promised the world was wider than she had ever dared to imagine. The morning after the rain, the Silver Briar Inn hummed with the quiet rhythm of daily life. Guests arrived and departed, travelers swapping stories over breakfast, merchants haggling over prices, and servants scurrying to fulfill their duties. Yet through it all, Ilara could not shake the memory of him, the tall, commanding figure who had stepped into her life and held her hand so effortlessly, so deliberately, that it had seemed the world itself had paused for the moment. It was not until evening that she learned his name. Whispers traveled like wind through the common room, voices low and cautious as villagers speculated about the noble who had stayed. "The Duke of Raventon," someone murmured. "Ilara, did you see him? They say he's as shrewd as he is ruthless," a maid whispered, eyes wide with both fear and fascination. Duke Alaric Thorne, the name hung in the room like the scent of rain-soaked earth, strong, commanding, yet tinged with danger. Raventon lay far to the east, a duchy whose borders were fiercely defended, whose lands were fertile and prosperous, and whose duke had earned a reputation for both wisdom and ruthlessness. Some said he had settled disputes between warring lords with a stroke of his pen rather than a blade. Others whispered that he had crushed rebellion without hesitation when necessary. Ilara watched him from behind the counter as he ate his evening meal, seated apart from his soldiers with a quiet authority that made the room feel smaller, more contained, as if his presence alone commanded order. His hair, still damp from the storm, gleamed like burnished copper under the candlelight. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who listened as carefully as he commanded. When he smiled, a fleeting, almost secret smile, it was brief, like sunlight breaking through cloud cover, and yet it lingered long after, leaving her with a warmth she could not name. Her thoughts kept returning to his words from the night. Before, hesitation is not weakness, it unsettled her. It resonated in a part of her she had not examined in years. Ilara had spent her life relying on routine, on the rhythm of the inn and the expectations of others. But his words suggested something entirely different, that her choices mattered, not just her actions, but the courage behind them. Later that evening, she carried a pitcher of ale to his table. He looked up, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow around the two of them. "You run this place alone?" he asked. "With help during harvest season," she replied. "But mostly yes. That is no small burden." She shrugged, not knowing how to respond. It was indeed a burden, one she had carried for years, but it was hers. "It's mine," she said finally. He studied her in silence for several long heartbeats. "Would you sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. She hesitated, glancing around. No noble had ever invited her to sit at their table before. It was not customary, and yet there was something in the way he asked that made it feel safe. At her pause, he smiled faintly. "There it is again," he said. She blinked, caught off guard, and then let out a small, nervous laugh. She moved to the chair and lowered herself into it, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. The warmth of the wood felt grounding, yet nothing compared to the pull she still felt from him, even across the small space that separated them. They began with ordinary topics: the condition of the roads, the price of grain, the stubborn moods of the weather. He asked questions not with curiosity alone, but with a subtle attentiveness that made her feel heard in a way she rarely experienced. She answered honestly, speaking of the challenges she faced running the inn, the disputes between farmers, and the occasional trouble with wayward travelers. With every answer, she felt a strange sense of recognition in his gaze, as if he understood the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership, and the quiet strength it took to maintain both. "Why an inn?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost intimate in the quiet of the evening. "It chose me," she replied after a moment, surprised at the honesty of her own words. "And I chose not to run from it." He nodded, as if that simple statement contained a truth he had been seeking. "There is wisdom in accepting the life you are given," he said quietly, "and courage in remaining when you might leave." When the fire burned low and his soldiers retired for the night, Alaric stood. The shadows of the hearth flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his jaw and the intensity of his eyes. "Thank you for your company, Ilara Wynne," he said. Her heart skipped. Hearing her name on his lips, spoken with acknowledgement rather than formality, sent a warmth through her chest she could not explain. "Good night, my lord," she whispered. "Alaric," he corrected gently, leaning close so that the words carried a weeg. "HT," she had not anticipated. "When we are not in court." She felt a flutter of nerves and surprise. To hear her name and a personal touch to it, to be invited into familiarity rather than deference, left her disoriented. She watched him climb the stairs to his room, the soft click of his boots fading into the quiet of the inn. After he had gone, the inn seemed to exhale. The hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows along the walls. Ilara remained behind the counter, her mind replaying the moments of the evening. His gaze, the firmness of his hand when it had touched hers, the way he had listened with patience and understanding, all of it lingered like the memory of a song she could not yet fully name. That night, she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The inn was silent except for the distant howl of the wind and the occasional drip of rain from the eaves. Her thoughts returned again and again to the man who had entered her life so suddenly, who had recognized something in her that no one else had. Hesitation, he had said, was not weakness. The idea alone made her question everything she had known about herself. By morning, the storm had faded completely. Sunlight glinted off puddles in the road, illuminating the world with a crisp clarity. Yet within the inn, a tension remained. Ilara could not shake the feeling that her life, once confined to routine and certainty, had shifted irrevocably. The memory of his touch, the certainty in his words, and the quiet authority he carried clung to her like a second skin. She moved through her morning chores mechanically, tending to fires, sweeping floors, and preparing breakfast. But her mind was elsewhere, wandering roads she had never traveled, imagining conversations that had not yet been spoken. The memory of his hand lingered, a quiet fire she could not extinguish. And when the door to the inn opened again, letting in the soft morning light and the faint chill of the air. She felt in her chest the undeniable pull of something vast and unknown, a life beyond the inn, beyond the village, beyond the predictable world she had always known, a life that was waiting, just beyond her hesitation. The morning after their long evening conversation dawned clear and bright, the aftermath of the storm leaving the world washed in sharp, clean light. The Silver Briar Inn buzzed with the energy of early travelers, merchants arriving to stock up for the coming season, villagers bringing in their produce, and the occasional weary traveler seeking warmth and shelter. Yet no amount of noise, bustle, or routine could keep Ilara Wynne's thoughts from returning to him. Duke Alaric Thorn. The name still felt heavy on her tongue, as if merely speaking it aloud might summon him from memory into reality. She had watched him walk the inn's corridors, had felt the warmth of his hand brush against hers, and now that moment lingered in her mind like a small, persistent flame, impossible to ignore. She did not expect him to remain. Nobles traveled quickly, their schedules dictated by court, politics, and duty. Yet, throughout the morning, he lingered, moving about the inn, speaking to travelers with a measured authority, observing the village, even pausing to speak with the children who ran through the muddy streets. His soldiers, obedient and silent, moved with him, casting cautious glances at the villagers, ensuring order without imposing it. Ilara found herself drawn outside, carrying a small basket of herbs she had harvested from the garden behind the inn. The morning air smelled of wet earth and pine, of spring rain lingering on the breeze. She spotted him tending to a small flower bed near the edge of the property, kneeling carefully as if each plant required his personal attention. "You understand this land better than most travelers," he said, looking up and meeting her gaze as she approached. His voice was low, thoughtful, almost conversational. "These gardens, these fields, they speak to someone who listens. I listen because I have to," she replied softly. "An innkeeper hears everything, remembers everything, and sometimes what you hear matters more than what you see." He nodded, considering her words. "Would you ever leave this place?" he asked, and the question hit her with a force she did not anticipate. She froze, the basket clutched tightly in her hands. Leave the inn? Leave the home she had tended for years, the hearth that held her father's memory, the streets and villagers that depended on her. She had once dreamed of seeing distant cities, of watching the sun rise over unfamiliar seas. Yet those dreams had always seemed distant, impossible, weighed down by duty and responsibility. "I don't know," she admitted at last. "This inn needs me. The village, the people, they rely on me. Leaving, it feels like abandoning everything." He stepped closer, his gaze intense but not unkind. "And what do you need, Ilara?" No one had ever asked her that question. Not her father, not the villagers, not the nobles who had passed through seeking service or information. It was startling, a question that struck her with the weight of truth. She opened her mouth to speak, and then a messenger arrived, his breath short, his cloak soaked from the rain. He carried sealed letters, one addressed directly to Alaric. Alaric broke the seal, and his expression darkened almost imperceptibly. He read quickly, eyes scanning the text with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he looked up at her, a shadow of tension crossing his features. "I must return to Raventon," he said, his voice measured but edged with concern. "Sooner than planned." A dull ache spread through her chest. Disappointment, sharp and unwelcome, clenched at her stomach. She had felt, fleetingly, a hope that he might remain, that perhaps he had chosen to linger not out of duty, but out of something else. But duty was unyielding even for a duke. That evening, preparations for departure began. Soul. Dyers gathered their belongings, the clatter of boots and saddles echoing through the inn. Alaric approached her at the threshold, the same spot where he had first taken her hand during the storm. "I will not pretend this meeting meant nothing," he said quietly, "but I will not ask you to abandon your life lightly." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She understood the weight of his words. To leave everything behind would require more courage than she sometimes felt she possessed. And yet, in that moment, she felt the pull of something vast, something unknown that extended far beyond the walls of the inn. She hesitated, her fingers tightening instinctively around the edge of the doorway. And then, as if sensing the storm within her, he reached out and took her hand once more. The warmth was immediate, grounding, yet electrifying. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the rain-soaked fields, the village streets, and even the soldiers frozen in anticipation. "When you are ready to choose," he said softly, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "come to Raventon." Then, just as suddenly as the moment had begun, he released her hand. He mounted his horse, and the party began to move. Alara stood rooted, unable to speak, as the horse's hooves splashed in the puddles, carrying him farther and farther down the muddy road. She watched until the figures vanished over the horizon, swallowed by the fading light of evening. The inn felt impossibly quiet. Tea. The echoes of her heartbeat loud against the walls. She knew, without doubt, that life as she had known it had ended the moment he first extended his hand and offered her the choice. The night that followed was restless. Alara moved about the inn mechanically, lighting lamps, checking rooms, and tending fires, but her mind remained fixed on the road, on him, on the words he had spoken. "When you are ready to choose." The thought both thrilled and terrified her. A life of responsibility and familiarity awaited her, as did a life of unknown possibility, one she had never dared to imagine. Sleep eventually claimed her, but the dreams were vivid and unrelenting. She saw herself walking down roads lined with unfamiliar trees, crossing rivers under the pale light of dawn, her hand intertwined with his. She saw herself leaving behind the inn, the hearth, and the village, stepping into a life that demanded courage, honesty, and the willingness to embrace uncertainty. And yet, she also saw the inn standing strong, the village prospering, and herself, still Alara Wynn, torn between two worlds. When morning came, the sun rose over the fields in gold and amber, spilling light over rooftops and wet streets. Alara looked out at the road he had taken and realized the truth. The choice now rested with her. She could remain, bound by duty and love for the familiar, or she could step into a world where nothing was guaranteed, where the warmth of a hand once held might guide her into uncharted territory. Ori. And in that moment, she understood that hesitation was no longer a refuge but a test. A life beyond the inn waited, but only if she was brave enough to walk the road he had shown her. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and earth, and with it a promise. A life of possibilities stretched before her, as vast and uncertain as the horizon itself. Life at the Silver Briar Inn did not pause because a duke had passed through. The days carried on with their usual rhythm, morning chores, preparing meals, tending fires, welcoming travelers, and mending both the inn's ware and the occasional torn temper. Yet beneath the routine, everything had shifted for Alara Wynn. She could feel it in the way she walked, in the subtle flutter in her chest when the wind carried the scent of rain, in the way the evening stretched long and quiet, as if holding their breath for something yet to come. Alaric's departure left a vacuum she had not anticipated. The inn seemed smaller, quieter, emptier, though the villagers went about their daily lives as usual. Still, whenever she walked past the threshold where he had taken her hand, her mind drifted to that fleeting touch, to the warmth of his palm and the steady assurance of his words. "When you are ready to choose, come to Raventon." She had clung to that phrase as one might cling to a lifeline. Every morning she repeated it to herself, silently weighing the comfort of the inn against the unknown world he had hinted at. The seasons changed slow, each one etching its mark upon the land and upon her. Spring brought tender shoots of green and the buzz of bees. Summer brought heat and the long days of harvest. When the inn thrummed with activity, autumn carried a chill in the evenings and the scent of falling leaves, and winter arrived harsh and unyielding, blanketing the fields with snow and frost. During those months, letters arrived, not often but steadily, carried by messengers who braved rain, mud, and snow to ensure her words reached him and his reached her. Each envelope bore the seal of Raventon, each stroke of the Duke's hand familiar and deliberate. His letters spoke of council meetings, of tense negotiations at court, of matters of state that weighed heavily upon his shoulders. Yet, in between these accounts, he asked after her, after the inn, after her thoughts on small details that others would have dismissed as trivial. How had the harvest fared? Did the villagers fare well this season? Had the roads worsened with the rain? Elara responded in kind, careful but honest. Her letters were longer than his, filled with vivid descriptions of the inn, the villagers, the weather, and occasionally the quiet stirrings of her own heart. She did not write of longing or fear, not explicitly, but it was there in the spaces between words, in the gentle way she described life and the subtle yearning behind each sentence. Time passed, and with it, the inn grew busier than ever. Refugees from nearby lands, displaced why skirmishes along Raventon's borders, arrived in need of food and shelter. Elara took them in without hesitation, extending hospitality as her family had done for generations. The work was exhausting, yet fulfilling, and all the while she carried Alaric's presence with her like a second heartbeat, a quiet awareness that the world beyond the village was larger than she had ever dared imagine. Winter was particularly harsh that year. Snowdrifts blocked the roads, and travelers were often forced to stay longer than planned. The inn's hearth roared with life, flames crackling as if to challenge the cold outside. One evening, as Elara carried a tray of bread and stew to a group of weary travelers, she paused at the doorway. The firelight danced across the walls, illuminating the familiar carvings of her ancestors and the shadows they had left behind. She realized, suddenly, that she had changed. She was no longer merely the innkeeper who maintained routine and order. She had grown, sharper, wiser, more aware of the impact of her choices. Each decision she made affected not just herself, but the lives of those who depended upon her. She felt a quiet strength that had always existed, waiting for recognition, and she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the choice Alaric had presented her with was no longer a distant dream. It was real, tangible, pressing against her like the cold wind outside. When spring finally returned, it did so with an almost celebratory brilliance. Flowers bloomed along the inn's garden paths, birds sang from the eaves, and the village seemed to stretch and yawn after a long winter. On one of these bright mornings, a messenger arrived bearing a letter sealed with the familiar crest of Raventon. Elara's heart beat faster than it had in months as she broke the seal. The letter was brief, far more so than the others. Its contents were direct, urgent, yet gentle. "I need you here, not as an innkeeper, as yourself." She read it 3 times, each reading deepening the flutter in her chest. Not as an innkeeper, as herself. The phrase resonated with clarity she could not ignore. All the letters, all the months of waiting, all the seasons of care and responsibility, they had led to this moment. She was being called not for duty, not for obligation, but for the person she had always been beneath the routine, beneath the hearth and the dust and the familiar faces of the village. Elara spent the evening pacing the floors of the inn. The firelight flickered against the walls, and she paused often, her gaze lingering on the door he had once crossed, on the counter where their hands had met. The decision that had once seemed impossible now appeared attainable. She could leave. She could choose a life that promised uncertainty, adventure, and the chance to follow her heart. Packing was an experience she approached methodically, yet with a quiet thrill, She selected only what she would need for the journey, leaving the familiar comforts of the inn behind temporarily, confident that she would return one day, whether as a visitor, a correspondent, or someone who had gained the freedom to live beyond the walls she had always known. At dawn, the village stirred as usual. The smell of fresh bread and damp earth filled the air, yet Alara barely noticed. Her mind and heart were focused entirely on the journey ahead. She carried a small satchel, her boots dusted with the early light of morning, and her cloak draped neatly across her shoulders. She paused one last time at the doorway of the inn, taking in the familiar sights, the hearth, the counter, the rooms that had held generations of her family, the fields where villagers worked tirelessly, the paths lined with flowers she had planted herself. And then she stepped forward. The road to Raventon stretched before her, the horizon bathed in golden sunlight. Every step felt both terrifying and exhilarating, a tangible confirmation that hesitation had passed, and choice had taken its place. She carried with her the lessons of the inn, the patience, the strength, the understanding that leadership was not merely a matter of authority, but of care, empathy, and courage. As she rode the first miles toward the east, she imagined what awaited her, a duchy she had only glimpsed in letters and conversations, a man who had seen her for who she truly was, and a life that was yet unwritten, filled with potential and uncertainty. For the first time in years, Alara felt truly free, not constricted, led by the boundaries of expectation or routine. And though the road ahead was long and unknown, one thought anchored her through the uncertainty. When the Duke had extended his hand, he had not demanded her loyalty or obedience. He had offered her choice, and now she was choosing to step forward, to embrace the unknown, and to walk toward a future that promised both challenge and possibility. Raventon rose before Alara like a vision carved from stone and sunlight. The city sprawled along the river, its towers gleaming under the morning sun, banners snapping crisply in the breeze. Streets were lined with cobblestones, busy with merchants, courtiers, and the soft hum of distant industry. It was a world far removed from the quiet village she had left behind, a place of authority, politics, and unmistakable grandeur. And at its center stood the palace of Duke Alaric Thorn, imposing and elegant, the seat of power she had only glimpsed in letters and imagination. Her heart pounded as she approached the gates. Months of waiting, countless letters, and the steady pull of longing had led her to this moment. She carried a small satchel, practical and light, and her cloak was fastened firmly against the morning chill. Yet no preparation could steady the storm of anticipation, fear, and hope that swirled in her chest. The guards at the gate regarded her with polite curiosity, then quickly recognized the seal on her letter. Word of her arrival had spread. Moments later, she was ushered through the grand courtyard and into the palace itself. Marble floors gleamed beneath her boots. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, and tapestries depicting battles, hunts, and celebrations hung along the walls. Everything was magnificent. Yet her eyes sought only one presence, the man who had drawn her heart out of the familiar safety of the Silver Briar Inn. And there he was. Alaric stood near the balcony overlooking the gardens, his cloak falling in precise folds around his shoulders, his posture commanding yet relaxed. His hair caught the sunlight, and his eyes, sharp, gray, and piercing, met hers instantly. The moment felt suspended in time. Her breath caught. All the letters, all the months of waiting, and all the lessons of patience and courage culminated in this singular instant. "You came," he said, his voice low and certain, carrying a mixture of relief, wonder, and something she could not yet name. She nodded, unable to speak at first. I had to," she whispered. "Your letter, it asked me to come as myself, and I am here." His lips curved into a faint, genuine smile. the same smile that had haunted her thoughts for months, fleeting and subtle, yet unmistakable. He took a step forward, closing the space between them, yet still allowing the grandeur of the palace to surround them. Alaric extended his hand, deliberately, without command, without expectation. The gesture was an invitation, not an order, not a declaration of authority, but a recognition of equality. Thank you. Of choice. Ilara felt a shiver run through her. She had hesitated once before, at the Silver Briar Inn, torn between safety and possibility. This time, there was no hesitation. Her fingers met his, warm and steady, and she felt the grounding certainty that had drawn her to him in the first place. I did not expect you to come, he said softly, though his eyes betrayed his hope. I did not know if you would truly take the step, and yet I did, she replied, her voice stronger now, confident. Not as an innkeeper, not as someone defined by routine or expectation, but as myself, and I choose this. For a moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, each feeling the gravity of the decision and the freedom it represented. Around them, the palace continued its life, servants moving silently, courtiers going about their duties, but in that space, there was only the connection between two people who had chosen each other freely. Alaric's expression softened. Then you are no longer bound to hesitation, he said, and I am grateful for it. Ilara's heart swelled. The months of waiting, the letters, the longing, and the courage it had taken to step away from all she knew were validated in his words, in the quiet power of their joined hands. She realized that life was never about certainty, about clinging to the familiar. It was about the willingness to step forward into the unknown, to embrace possibility, and to trust. They walked through the palace gardens together, side by side, hands still entwined. The flowers of spring bloomed in riotous colors. The air carried the scent of warm earth and new beginnings, and the world seemed to expand around them, alive with promise. Alaric spoke quietly of the duchy, of reforms and plans, yet he listened to her as if every word she spoke mattered as much as the decrees of the council. Ilara, he said, halting their steps beneath an arch of blooming wisteria, I do not know what the future holds, but I do know that I want you in it, not as an observer, not as a guest, but as my equal, as my partner, as the person who walked to me despite all hesitation. Her chest tightened with emotion, and she pressed closer to him. And I do not know what awaits either, she admitted, but I know that I want to face it with you. He lifted her hand to his lips briefly, a gentle, grounding gesture that spoke volumes of respect, care, and acknowledgement. Then we face it together, he said. The rest of the day passed in a soft, dreamlike blur. Courtiers noticed her arrival and whispered about the innkeeper who had become the Duke's companion. Yet Alaric remained focused solely on her. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle touch reinforced the understanding that their connection was rooted not in obligation or convenience, but in choice and courage. As evening fell, the palace bathed in golden light and shadows stretched across the courtyard. They stood together on a balcony overlooking the gardens, hands still entwined. The city below bustled with life, but here, in this quiet corner of stone and bloom, the world was reduced to the certainty of each other. Ilara, Alaric said, his voice soft yet resolute. Thank you for taking the step, for choosing, for trusting. She met his gaze and smiled, a mixture of relief, joy, and quiet triumph flooding through her. Thank you, she replied, for waiting, for offering the choice, for holding my hand when I hesitated. He stepped closer, bringing his forehead to hers for a brief, grounding moment. And now, he whispered, we move forward together. Together. The word carried the weight of months of anticipation, letters filled with longing, and countless small decisions that had led her to this moment. The hand he had extended was no longer a tentative gesture. It was a bridge to a shared future, a promise built on trust, courage, and the willingness to step beyond hesitation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the palace and gardens in warm amber light, Alara understood something profound. Life was no longer measured by hesitation, by fear, or by the safety of routine. Life was measured by the choices we dared to make, by the hands we accepted, by the courage to walk unknown roads. And she had chosen. The innkeeper and the duke walked forward together, their hands clasped, their hearts aligned, stepping into a future that neither could fully predict, but both were ready to embrace. And for the first time in her life, Alara felt the exhilarating freedom of living not in the shadow of expectation, but in the light of her own choice. More stories will keep coming, so please don't forget to like and subscribe.